Please. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Commission's community conversation and celebration of alliteration, I think, here at the Robina Community Hall. My name's Bernie Hobbs, and I'm rapt to be here as the chair of the forum this evening. If my name sounds familiar, it might be you might have heard me talking science on ABC radio here at the Gold Coast. You might have seen my face on the New Inventors some years ago as one of the judges there, and got another familiar face there from that long-gone TV show as well, but she's in another role tonight as one of the commissioners for the Climate Commission. Now, before we get started tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders from other communities who may be here tonight. And we have got a few housekeeping matters. You would have seen the signage when you came in. These conversations have been happening right around the country, and one of the things that happens at each conversation is that we film it, and that's so that not just the people who are able to make it on the night can hear, can be part. We film it and put those videos up on the website afterwards, and anyone can go and watch and learn from the questions and answers that happen during the night. So if you ask a question tonight, you will be filmed and you will be asked to fill out a release form, which is very rock and roll and quite TV, so you can get a little bit of that gold dust celebrity feeling on you as well. If you wouldn't like to be filmed, if you don't want to film, you would have been advised earlier, so you should be sitting down the back there. You also would have noticed when you sat down, I hope you did anyway, otherwise it could be quite uncomfortable for you, there would be 3 documents. This, the Critical Decade 2013 Climate Change Science, Risks and Responses, is the latest report coming from the Climate Commission. It's quite a hefty tome, but luckily there's a much more reader-friendly summary document that goes with it, and the very important feedback form that helps make sure that the way we're running these forums is giving you what you want, giving you the chance to hear the science, to hear the risks and responses, and giving you the chance to ask your questions of the commissioners and have them answered. You also would have gotten a free gift, 1 biro, with which you can then fill out the feedback form a little later on, so make good use of that, please. Just in the final of the housekeeping, we've got 2 emergency exits, one here and one over there, just where the emergency lights are. Toilets are out in the hallway, and don't forget there'll be free tea and coffee a little later when you can also meet the commissioners and continue your discussions with them. If you haven't already, please turn your mobile phones to silent now so that we can all be very focused on what we're doing. Now, just to give you a rundown on how the evening's going to run, we will get a synopsis, a kind of a preview of what's in this latest report from the authors of the report, Will Stephan and Leslie Hughes. That'll be the start of the evening, so we'll hear the latest science, what's new, and how the risks are being measured against what we're observing through that science. So that's going to be a presentation. That'll probably take about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll get straight to your questions. It's not a lecture. It's really all about giving you a chance, as many of you as possible, to ask questions of the commissioners. So we've got expertise in the climate science, in environment, in business, in industry, technology, economics and policy. So covering all of those areas, and that's what we want to get through tonight, your questions on those areas. So enough from me. I'd like to hand over to our Chief of the Climate Commission, Professor Tim Flannery. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Tim. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist, former Australian of the Year and held various academic positions. But he's here tonight in his role as the Chief of the Climate Commission. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tim Flannery.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Bernie, and thank you all for being here tonight for our 21st Community Forum as a Climate Commission. We've conducted forums around Australia now, from Alice Springs to Melbourne and Hobart and Perth, right across the country, Mackay. But it is great to be here because this evening we'll be discussing what I think is one of our most significant reports to date. It's the Climate Commission's 26th report. It what it does is summarise the science around climate change in a way I think that is very accessible and very, very thorough, and makes some very important points, because there's been advances made in climate change over the last few years that allow us to be more insightful and definitive about some aspects of the science, things that have been not so clear before. So it's a great opportunity to ask any questions you have of our climate scientists, and also to enjoy the report. I should introduce our commissioners. We have Professor Will Steffen here, who's the lead author on our report. He's really a world authority on the way Earth's climate system works. So any questions you have about the climate system, Will is a good person to ask. Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University, co-author on the report, who is an expert on both adaptation to climate change, adapting to climate change, but also on the impacts of a changing climate on Australia's biodiversity, another important area. And then we have Commissioner Professor Veena Sahajwalla from the University of New South Wales, who is an engineer, has been working for many years now with the Australian steel industry and with recycling products in general. We kind of refer to her as a solutions commissioner, really. She has tremendous knowledge, not only about Australian industry, but about the kind of solutions that are required in order to reduce emissions. And then we have Roger Beale at the end here, Commissioner Roger Beale, who has had a very long history of engagement in climate change, particularly in the international negotiations. And Roger sits on the Premier of China's Advisory Committee on Climate Change, so he is very knowledgeable about what other countries are doing around the world, what approaches they're taking, and also he's a very respected economist, so any questions around economic instruments, Roger is a very good person to ask. The one commissioner who's not here this evening and can't be with us is Mr Jerry Houston, who spent his life in the oil and gas sector, ended his career as the CEO of BP Australasia. He really represents our business voice. It may surprise you that we have someone from the oil and gas sector on the Climate Commission, but the fact is the large companies of the world are very familiar with this issue and have many long-standing programs in place to deal with all aspects of climate change. And sorry that Jerry can't be with us, but we'll do our best to answer any business-related questions. I'm going to hand over to Will in a second to show this presentation, but just to reinforce that this really is your night. We want to hear your questions. Don't hold back, ask us whatever you want, but we will have this short presentation of the findings of the report first. So Will, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. And we'll try to be very brief. Leslie and I are going to do a tag team presentation on the basic science and what it actually means for us. So let's dive right in. This is the sort of graph people are familiar with. This is global average air temperature from 1880, when we first could get a global average, all the way up to the present. And you can see that not every year is warmer or colder than the one before it. There's a lot of variability in the record, but the long-term trend is quite clear. The Earth is warming, and in fact, since about 1960 or 70, it's quite pronounced. But actually, even though that's sort of the poster child of climate change, scientists actually look at this graph a lot more often. That's the ocean heat content. And again, you see an upward trend. It goes from 1960 to the present, and it continues on up through the last decade unabated. Why are we interested in this? 90% of the excess heat at the Earth's surface actually goes into the ocean. Only 3% goes into the air. Big, much bigger thermal capacity of the ocean. It covers 2/3 of the Earth's surface, often to depths of 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers. That's where the heat's going. That's where the most reliable record is. Now we understand why this is occurring too. Scientists have known this for a long time. The greenhouse effect is a physical phenomenon that's been known for almost 200 years. The first paper on it was actually published in 1824. It works like this. There's a belt of gases around the Earth's surface in the lower atmosphere. When you get on an airplane and fly to Europe or even fly down to Melbourne, you're flying over most of the greenhouse gases. They're below you in the atmosphere. But they have an interesting property. They allow sunlight and ultraviolet radiation from the sun. They allow that to come through almost unimpeded. But to keep its balance, the Earth must release energy back out to space, or else we would eventually burn up. So we have to keep a balance. The Earth does that by emitting heat, not light. And that's a different wavelength, as we say in physics. That's where the gases come in. They let the sunlight in, but they absorb some of the heat going out. And that changes the energy balance at the Earth's surface. It makes it warmer than it otherwise would be. It's a natural effect. The Earth would be 33 degrees colder without the natural greenhouse gases. So it's very important. So on that right-hand panel, if humans are putting additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, as we know we are, from burning fossil fuels primarily, the physics is clear. They're going to trap more heat, just like a doona with more feathers traps more heat if you put it on your bed. Same thing. So this is a no-brainer for scientists. We understand this very well, and we can test it. And this is what I'm going to do here. This little wavy purple line is what the temperature of the last century, that goes from 1900 to 2000. So the last century, you should have got variability in temperature. You always do. There is natural variability all the time. That's what the temperature should have done. Now, if in our climate model we, in addition, put in greenhouse gases, that's what the temperature should have done. You still have natural variability, and they match up until 1960 or so. And then one starts to rise, one with the extra greenhouse gases. Now, fortunately, we have observations for that whole period, so we can see which one is right. The observations are the black line. So you see the climate models do a really good job of simulating what temperature is actually done, only if you put the additional greenhouse gases from human activities in there. Now I could go on and on. There's heaps of evidence, a lot more than that. So this part of the science is absolutely clear and well understood. The Earth is warming. The primary reason are the additional greenhouse gases. Well, what does it matter for us? And that's where Leslie has a lot more to say than I do.
Thanks, Will. If climate change wasn't going to have any impacts, we wouldn't really be worrying about it. It would be a purely academic problem of people like Will sitting at a computer all day. But we care about it because of the impacts it has on us and our environment. So let's go to where you guys live, the Gold Coast. And there's a lot more detail about potential impacts on the Gold Coast in the report and for Australia generally. But here's some edited highlights. One of the things, and I'm really talking about Queensland now rather than just the Gold Coast, one of the things that we're expecting to happen, and I'll show you another slide on this in a minute, is that climate change will make the normal sort of extreme events that we experience from time to time even more extreme. And one of the things that we'd be worried about in North Queensland in particular are tropical cyclones. We're not expecting to get more tropical cyclones, but we are expecting to get that the cyclones that we do get will be more intense, so more number 4s and number 5s. Rising sea levels are happening all over the world. The average rate at the moment is about 3 millimetres per year. The east coast of Australia is about at the average, though there are other parts of Australia where sea level is rising quite a lot more than that. And these will have all sorts of impacts, and particularly will exacerbate existing problems of beach erosion, which you do have along the Gold Coast. The modelling done by the Department of Climate Change indicates that Queensland has the most infrastructure at risk of all of the states from rising sea level, and estimates that if sea levels rise to 1.1 metres, which is within the realms of possibility by the end of the century, somewhere between 36,000 and 57,000 buildings in Queensland are at risk, and they identified the top 6 local government areas at risk, and the Gold Coast is one of those top 6. Tourism is an enormously important industry for Queensland. It's worth about $17.5 billion a year and directly employs 124,000 people. And much of Queensland's tourism, and indeed much of Australian tourism, relies on the iconic natural environment that we have, particularly the Great Barrier Reef, but many other areas as well. And we know that particularly the Great Barrier Reef is already suffering from climate change. Before 1979, there was no bleaching known on the Great Barrier Reef, and we've had multiple episodes since that time when we get an underwater heat wave, the corals get stressed, throw out their symbiotic algae, they bleach and die. We've had a number of extremely serious events, Add into that ocean acidification that is happening because the oceans are absorbing a lot of the CO2, and we have all sorts of problems for our marine life. Which leads me on to biodiversity, which is my passion and has been for the last 20 odd years or so. Queensland, especially North Queensland, especially your rainforests and your reef, are the most biodiverse areas, some of the most biodiverse areas on the planet and the most biodiverse areas in Australia. Many species are rare, many species are very restricted to very small ranges and small populations, and those are precisely the sorts of species that will be most vulnerable in the future. So I just said that what we're most worried about is the impact of climate change on extremes. When we talk about rises in average temperature, it's hard to get very excited. You know, what does a rise in average temperature of a degree mean? People go, well, so what? Well, let me show you now a very simple demonstration about why a rise in average actually is quite important. Have a look at this. I'm just seeing if my laser pointer works here. No? Anyway, never mind. Have a look at that curve there. Let's imagine that that curve represents temperatures over a single year. So at the far end, we've got a few cold days. At this end, we've got a few hot days. And then we've got mostly average days. When we shift the average temperature, this is what happens. If the distribution completely shifts only by a little bit, have a look at what happens to the ends of that graph. We've lost all those cold days, and indeed we are getting fewer and fewer cold days in Australia and in the world. The relatively small number of hot days now becomes quite a lot of hot days, and we've had about twice as many hot days now than we did in the 1960s. And now we've got a new tail of the graph with a lot of really, really hot days that we've never experienced before. Last summer was the hottest summer in Australia on record. We had the hottest day. We broke over 120 climate records just last summer. Our rainfall has also been changing, and we're all very aware of this, particularly along the east coast. What this map shows, the greeny bluey areas are where it's been getting wetter, and you can see it's been getting wetter up in the north and the northwest. The browny areas are the areas that have been getting drier since about the 1970s, and as you can see from this map, the southwest and right down the eastern part of Australia has been getting drier, and you'll notice that Queensland has been getting very dry. Will talked about models before, and how well, on the whole, the models are matching the observations. But in some cases, the models are actually not getting it very right at all. In some cases, they've been a bit too conservative. So I want to just show you this graph. This is a graph of Arctic sea ice. The bottom axis is the time going back to the start of last century, and that sort of bluey, purpley, grey band is what the models projected should be happening to Arctic sea ice as the world has been warming up. The Arctic sea ice melts when it gets warm. That little black wiggly line is what's actually been happening, and what you can see there is that the ice is melting faster than the models projected. So in some cases the models are getting it about right, in other cases things are happening faster than we expected. Over to Will now.
Well, the next part of the story is what should we do about it and what are we doing about it? The thing to note is a lot of countries recognize this science and are taking action. There are 35 countries there, you can see their flags, that now have national emission trading schemes. And you see the Australian flag down there. We have one too. It's fixed price for the moment, but we'll go to a trading scheme in 2015. And another country is about ready to be added, a really important one, and that's China. Yesterday, China launched its first trial system in one of the large Chinese cities. That'll be expanded to 4 or 5 provinces, and I think by 2015 they're going to go national. So this is a common way, probably the most common way that countries are taking to getting emissions down to slow and eventually stabilize the climate. Here in Australia, we've had some very significant and meaningful action too. Just a month or so ago, we passed the 1 million mark for the number of households that have photovoltaic solar panels on their roof. And you can see how dramatically from 2007, you can see just a little blue bar on 2007, and by 2013, 6 years later, we're over 1 million. That increases much, much faster than any economist predicted, or anyone for that matter predicted. So again, people are taking action and recognizing the problem. But when you do the maths, we still have a big challenge ahead of us. If we want to limit climate change to a temperature rise of no more than 2 degrees, and remember we're approaching 1 degree in average temperature, and as Leslie showed, 2 degrees would have a massive impact on extreme events. We don't want it to go any higher than that. We've signed up to that target as a country, and so have virtually every other country around the world. This is a well-established target. Scientists can then calculate how much we can emit. Well, the answer is between 2000 and 2050, about 1 trillion tons, 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide. It's a pretty big number. Doesn't mean we have to abandon fossil fuels today. It means there is ultimately a limit. The interesting fact is the first 13 years of that period, we've emitted about 40% of that budget. So if you have a monthly budget for your household expenses, and you spend it too fast, that means you're going to be pinched the second half of the month. And we're definitely being pinched now in our carbon budget. All right, that's the nature of the challenge. Emissions have to come down fast and very deeply, and it's global, not just Australia. Scientists like me love to throw numbers around like that. It's a bit esoteric. It's hard to get your hand around it. Leslie's very good at making these sort of things personal. And she's going to wind us up by telling why it matters for her and her family.
Okay. As Will said, we love graphs, but graphs aren't all that meaningful for lots of people, so I want to make this graph personal, but let me explain what the graph is firstly. Once again, we've got 200 years on the x-axis down the bottom, going back to 1900, and that little first black wiggly line is the temperature that we've already had. And what this graph shows us is 2 potential futures, or at least a range of futures. As Will said, the countries around the world have agreed that we need to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees above the average in pre-industrial times. And that's that dotted line, maximum of 2 degrees. In order to keep to 2 degrees, or preferably a bit less than that, we need to control greenhouse gas emissions very seriously, and that would give us that blue future there. If we keep going at the same rate of emissions as we're going now, which is still accelerating, what we're looking at is the red future. Now, why does that matter? Well, just to put this in perspective, if we get to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, that's warmer than we have ever had while humans have been on the planet. A 5-degree difference is the difference between an ice age and now. 5 degrees doesn't sound like very much. 5 degrees is the difference between an ice age and now. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to make this personal. I was born in the 1960s, and if I live till I'm 85, that bar there represents the average temperature that I will experience over my lifetime. Now, I've got 2 teenage children. They were born in the mid-1990s, and if they have about the same lifespan as me, that's the temperature that they will experience over their lifetime if we keep going the way we are now, above 2 degrees. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but if my kids have kids when they're about 30 and they live till they're about 85, well, my grandkids will live into the next century. And if we keep going the same way we're going now, my grandkids, your grandkids, could experience temperatures up there. So what we really need to work very, very hard at doing is bringing that line right down to a climate that is stable and a climate that we can all live in. And with that, we'll hand over to Bernie. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Leslie and Will. And that last graph in particular, certainly sobering with the bringing it home to all you people who thoughtlessly had grandchildren. I think my dogs will be well dead before it gets to any dangerous temperature changes. It's now time for your questions, and we really want to make sure that we get as many of you, let as many of you have an opportunity to ask a question as we can. Without fail, the feedback from the previous forums that have been run by the Climate Commission have always had two big complaints. One is that there were a lot of long-winded comments instead of questions, and the other is that I had my hand up and didn't get asked. So we're really going to work very hard tonight to try and make sure that everyone who has a question has a great shot at getting that question asked and answered. And that means, if you think about it, we've got about an hour. We really want to keep the questions down with their answers to about 2 or 3 minutes. So I want you to try and keep your question to about 30 seconds. If you know that you've got a reputation for talking at length, like perhaps I do, then maybe you want to write that question down beforehand and just make sure you've got a clear question in your mind. We won't be having comments tonight. I'm sorry, this is a night where you get a chance to put a question to the commissioners. We want you to keep your questions short so that everyone else gets a chance as well. And for that reason, only one question per person. If we do get to a time at the end when we've run out of questions, certainly we'll let people have a second shot at questions. We might even get time for a comment if we run out of questions completely. But the basic guideline is, when you've got a chance to ask a question, please keep it brief, and I'll be directing you to get to the question if you're having trouble with that. Now, we've got 4 microphones. If the people with the microphones can just make themselves known. So what I'd like you to do, if you've got a question, and I'm sure that there are people waiting already, just put your hand up, please, and we'll get microphones to you, and we'll start getting those questions. We need some more microphones. I feel like I'm running, some more questions. I feel like we're running an auction here, but so we've got some questions around the place there. And if we could start, yes, good. If we can start at the back there, and I think the gentleman in the 3rd row there, and down the front here. And yes, so, and when you have your question, if you could just stand, please, so we can all see you, and say your name. Now, don't forget, you will be asked to sign a release form because we are being videoed, so that'll come after the question. That's all the formalities. Your 30 seconds, please, your name and your question. Thank you.
My name's Derricka Ogden, and I'm wondering what they're doing about methane emissions.
Methane emissions.
Yeah, methane emissions are also important, along with nitrous oxide. They're the 3 big ones with CO2. Methane emissions, human ones, normally come from agriculture. They come from 2 things. They come from animals like beef cattle, and they come from irrigated agriculture. They are an important greenhouse gas, but they have a short lifetime in the atmosphere, about 10 years. It is important for a number of reasons that we get these down as well. But the main problem, from a scientific point of view, is the CO2. It has a much longer lifetime. It's in the atmosphere at much higher concentrations. So even if we got methane emissions back down to natural levels, we'd still be left with the bulk of the problem. So it's a good thing to do to get methane emissions down, but the real story is with CO2.
We also know that methane comes predominantly also from landfills, so landfill gas. And that's another important sort of connection to understand that, when we put waste into landfills, the emission of methane is certainly something that we need to be mindful of. So that's another opportunity for us to bring those emissions down if we minimise how much actually ends up in landfill.
I just point out one other thing. Of course, coal seam methane, methane from fossil fuels, fugitive emissions are another important source and need to be taken into account.
And I love that we got a question in 3 seconds, and then we had 3 commissioners throw in an answer, all within that 2-minute limit. Well done. Vina, I'm not sure if it was your Hollywood hair that was causing all that rustling on the microphone, but hopefully we're finished with that for now. Now, we have another question here. If you can keep your arms up so I know who's got the microphone. Yes, and yes, your question, please, and your name first.
I'm Mary Knapp. Professor Flannery just touched on what I intend to ask. What is the impact of coal seam gas and especially fracking?
In terms of greenhouse gases and in terms of fugitive emissions, particularly, of everything. Look, that's a really huge question, and these are new technologies, and really some of those questions are outside the purview of the Climate Commission, if you want. So impacts on subterranean water and so forth are areas where we don't have any special expertise at all. But in terms of fugitive emissions, we have had a look at the state of knowledge there. It turns out that in places like the US, if fugitive emissions can be kept below about 1%, then the gas is a less carbon intense source than coal, for example. But if fugitive emissions exceed 3%, then the balance, because methane's a potent greenhouse gas, shifts, and the gas can be more carbon intensive or more greenhouse gas intensive than coal. So it depends very much on a number of factors, how big the fugitive emissions are, and of course all those other impacts you wanted to, we'd all love an answer to, but unfortunately we don't have.
Thanks. And we have a question over here, yes?
My name is Arthur Gullick. My question is, how can we sustain the present situation when the human explosion throughout the world, explosion of population? Now, what we'll do today will be not quite nullified, but won't be very much difference if the humans are exploding so fast in the world.
Thank you. So, population issue? Yeah.
Look, Arthur, that's a great question. It's one we get at almost every forum. The fact is that the overall human population continues to grow, and the United Nations census, if you want, of global population projects that the population will keep growing through till 2050 and maybe even beyond that, and that within 40 years we'll have to deal with an extra 2 billion people. So instead of 7 billion, we'll be up at 9 billion, and that of course puts pressure on the planet and all of its resources. If we're lucky and we manage this well, particularly if we can improve the state of the women in developing countries and give them more power over their own bodies and more economic opportunities, we'll see the population peak lower. So there's important lessons there for countries like Australia with programs. But really the bottom line is we need to do everything so much more efficiently. We need to make much more use of the resources that we already extract, and they include energy resources. And there is a lot of energy efficiency programs worldwide. It's quite reasonably why so much emphasis is placed on this issue. And here in Australia we see it with our manufacturing sector. Groups like Low Carbon Australia help industries invest in more energy efficient means of production. It's an absolutely central issue.
So I might just add one other quick point to that argument about resources, and that's absolutely right, that we have to sort of start to look at resources. Certainly energy is a big part of that. The other side of resource is the whole materials consumption. I mean, certainly as a society we do consume a broad spectrum of different types of products, whether it happens to be materials that go into making your TVs, computers, phones, or even just the basics, the steel and aluminum that we use as part of our daily lives. I think looking at resource conservation in the long run is going to become increasingly important, because resources aren't unlimited. We've got to look at how we might be able to be pretty smart about the way we recycle them. So that's another aspect of looking at resource conservation in the future, which is going to become increasingly important alongside our better understanding of use of renewable energy.
Thanks for that. Now, I'm sorry about the background noise there. We are just going to pretend that it's just really bad music happening until it gets resolved, so my apologies, but because of our limited time, I'd like us to keep going. I don't think it is your hair, but anyway, maybe tuck it, do a bit of a Veronica Lake look over there. If you could stand and give your name, please.
My name's Andrea. I think my question is probably for Professor Thiel. I'm just working out how to use a microphone.
Well, you're working out how to promote Roger to Professor too, so he's very interested in answering that one there. Well done.
Roger. Just about the emissions trading schemes, it seems like they're the economic instrument of choice for governments, and I'm just wondering if you could tell us if you feel that they are the most effective instrument to use on a large scale, and what are the risks of them not working, and what some of the, if there are any alternatives.
If you look around the world, there are a number of approaches that are used by almost everyone. One of those is renewable energy targets. So a specific encouragement, usually through targets, but also sometimes through subsidies for renewable energy. A second is energy efficiency requirements. So minimum energy efficiency requirements for all sorts of different pieces of equipment or for domestic appliances. or for the standards of insulation of housing and so on. But many, many countries, and probably 90% of economists, have argued that a broadly based carbon price of one sort or another can be delivered in many different ways. It's very important for driving change. Because price matters. Price drives behaviour, and as you, if you have a broadly based price with some form of trading associated with it, you then get an opportunity to encourage the economy to search out the cheapest and easiest way of cutting emissions. So, you achieve your emissions target, but you do it at less cost than if you have to do it by regulation. That's why it's become the instrument of choice for different countries in different ways, for social, economic and political reasons. But I think globally you're going to see the emergence of trading over the next decade or so that will be a very important part of building future global agreements and action.
Thank you. And yes, sir?
My name is Brian Feeney. I recently saw a presentation by Ian Dunlop from the Safe Climate Australia. He said last time the average temperature was 2 degrees warmer than now. The sea level was about 6 or 7 metres higher than we have now. This is obviously very relevant to the Gold Coast, where there are huge areas within 5 metres of sea level. What would you recommend to the Gold Coast City Council to be doing, not only about their own infrastructure, but also about development more generally in those low-lying parts of the city?
Okay, I'll have a crack at that, but I won't answer the recommendation thing directly because that's not something we do. But you're correct in stating that the last time the Earth was about 1.5 to 2 degrees higher in average temperature. Sea level was between 6 and 9 metres higher. But there's a timescale issue. It takes time for that amount of sea level to occur because it requires the melting or discharge of ice from these really big ice sheets on Antarctica and on Greenland. So the estimates of how fast this can occur are usually around a maximum of about 1 metre a century. So if you look at the IPCC projections, which do include some contribution from these big ice sheets, for this century, out to 2100, the end of the graph that Leslie showed, it's between about 20 centimetres and 80 centimetres, although there's some uncertainty at the top end because of the ice sheets. So the advice we give is not to tell or advise councils what to do, but advise them of what the science actually says. And that is sea level is going up without a doubt. There's no doubt about that. The rate is what the issue is. And I would say the IPCC's estimates of 0.2 to 0.8 of a metre by 2100 should be a pretty good range for councils to plan accordingly. Now when we think longer term, if you're thinking infrastructure out a couple hundred years, then you indeed could see a metre or two of sea level rise and still going up.
And if I could just add to that, we've been travelling around the country for the last 2.5 years and talking to lots of councils, and it's very clear that councils are where climate change adaptation is really important. They are at the grassroots. It's where the rubber hits the road of a lot of climate change impacts. And we have seen some extremely progressive councils around the country who are really taking science very seriously, who are holding community consultations about where things should and shouldn't be built. It's a very difficult question because a lot of infrastructure is built to last 50 to 100 years, and there's a lot of infrastructure already in very, very high-risk areas. So I think we would not dream to offer the Gold Coast City Council or any other council specific advice as to what they should do, other than, as Will says, to take the science seriously and to plan accordingly.
I just might add there, I chaired the Federal Government's Coastal Committee for some time, and what Leslie says is absolutely correct. But one of the lacks that we identified in Australia was a lack of integrated effort from the Federal Government through to the states, through to the councils, to address this issue, because of course there's enormous pressures on council, legal pressures and others, to permit development in areas that are vulnerable, but also issues regarding insurance and so forth. And I think it really is imperative that governments work together to address this issue. It's not something for one tier of government alone. It's something where we need a fully integrated approach, because it's a really substantial problem. And if you could just add, in terms of this 1 metre of sea level rise, sure, on average you get a metre, but that's not what you worry about. You worry about those extreme weather events, whether it be a flood or extratropical low or whatever it is, that brings a flooding. And, you know, raising sea levels, I think it's by 20 centimetres, Will, isn't it, around Australia, takes a 1 in a century event through to an event you...
No, it's a 50 centimetre rise. You'll see a very interesting graph in the report there. It's surprising the multiplication factor of these flooding events with modest sea level rise. So if you take a 50 centimetre rise, something like that, half a metre, and that's well within the IPCC range by the end of the century, you get multiplication factors at Bundaberg of about 100. So that means a 1 in 100 year flood at Bundaberg would happen every year. In Sydney, it's close to 1 in 1,000. So about a 1 in 100 year flooding event in Sydney would be happening every month. And that's with about a 50 centimetre sea level rise. That's because the things that give you flooding, the storm surges and the high tide, are now riding on an elevated sea everywhere. And so that does give you very, very big factors. And it's as Tim said, this is probably the most serious issue, long-term climate issue, for many coastal councils.
And I have to say that is described really beautifully both in the summary document and also in some of the materials that are available on the Climate Commission website. Your questions have been spectacular. I really appreciate how concise they're being. So thanks very much for that. Yes.
My name's Lois Levy. I was wondering if you could give me an opinion on the effectiveness of the LNP's direct action policy to reducing emissions.
Look, the Climate Commission, we're set up by the government. We're an independent authority that's funded by the government, and we really just do one thing. We provide information on climate change science, economics and international action. We don't go into discussions of policy because you immediately then enter a political furor where, you know, your authority to explain the science is eroded. So we've given away the power to answer questions like that, to retain the authority as a respected source of information. So we don't discuss policy issues. But could I say, if you're interested in having that question answered, it is imperative you go and ask the people who seek to represent you in an election what they think about climate change, what their actual policies will deliver. And go to both sides, go to everyone and ask those questions, because it's the only way that we as ordinary citizens can have an impact on such matters.
Thanks, Tim. We've got a few people with microphones already, so pop your hands up again in a minute if you wouldn't mind, sorry. So, yes, please, if you could stand and give your question.
Okay, my name is Sheila Davis. You mentioned cyclones up north and the high biodiversity of North Queensland. I've heard that cyclones will not only get stronger, but will also come further south. As the Gold Coast includes the hinterland part of the Mount Warning, Caldera, the Gold Coast Nature Conservation Strategy estimated that shows that we have an extremely high biodiversity in our city. One of the things that concerns me is that with rising oceans and more extreme weather events, including flooding, we're going to have demand for more development in the foothills and up in the mountains, with people moving off the floodplains and the beachfronts, thus increasing pressure on our remaining biodiversity habitats. So could you address how we can continue to conserve our natural areas in the face of increasing human demand for space?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult question. I think the way to regard climate change in the context of biodiversity as another stress on top of all the stresses that our biodiversity already faces. So we have a very poor record in Australia of conserving species. We have already lost at least 100 bird and mammal species, for example, since Europeans colonised the country. So our biodiversity is already under stress, as you say, from human development, from land clearing, from pollution, from over-harvesting, etc., etc. One of the things that is probably one of the few things that we can do to help biodiversity in the future cope with climate change is to reduce the impact of all the other stresses. It's one of the very few things that we can do. So I think we need to see conservation of biodiversity in a holistic way, with climate change factored in as one of the stresses. We need to put back a lot of vegetation that we've cleared. We need to connect up and consolidate the native habitat that we do have. And we need to really see conservation is now being conducted in a very dynamic and very rapidly changing physical environment, whereas most of our conservation policies have been set up with a static environment in mind. So it's a very, very big challenge.
Thanks, Leslie. And sir, down the front.
Hi, I'm Jim Warburton.
Right into the microphones, Jim.
I'm Jim Warburton, and thank you for putting on this session. I wanted to talk about, or ask a question about motivation, compensation, maybe litigation. Personally, I've tried to do my best to get my carbon down. But I went to a meeting last night about two major developments in the Tweed, which is Cobbacay Lakes and Kings Forest, and they seem to be inappropriate. They're in the coastal wetland region, and they were approved basically 30 years ago or something like that, and when the information wasn't there. But they're still looking like going ahead, so...
And your question?
My question is, what's the motivation for like councils and state governments and other approving people who are going to approve, well, your little house here that's going to fall into the ocean, or places that are going to be inundated, probably. Is there going to be, well, is there any compensation, for instance, to get them not to do it that way, or is there going to be litigation if they now know what it's all about, if they approve those situations?
Thanks, Jim. So
I'll have a go. I don't have a specific answer, but you might be interested. There was a front page article, I believe, I haven't read it myself, but I've been told about it in the Courier Mail either today or yesterday, which summarises a recently published CSIRO and University of Queensland study about the impacts of inundation risk in particular on insured values of houses. There's nothing that frightens Australians more than if their house price goes down. So I think one of the drivers, as you say, motivation, will be, can I insure this property? And as an expert on insurance told me once, and it's always stuck into my head, if you can't insure it, it's not worth anything. And as we can see in Queensland already, there are parts of Queensland now that you cannot insure your house against flood. So if there's one highly motivating factor, I think it's going to be a house price.
Thank you. And the lady down the back, just behind you, yes? With your hand up, yep.
Hello, thank you, Sally Spain, Wildlife Queensland. I really appreciate the commentary on the biodiversity and the special place it has, particularly of world significance, which perhaps will be also a factor in the conversation if the conversation continues rationally. The other factor I think that we have looked at locally because of the exacerbation of development on the floodplain here is when a crisis becomes a tragedy because you have an ignorant population, you have no evacuation strategy. That would be something we would probably ask that the Commission recommend, that there be movements out, which are difficult sometimes in those circumstances. But my question basically is, can the Climate Commission recommend in its findings that the conversation about climate change be improved? Skeptics are people to do with religion and philosophy, not scientifically proven facts, but certainly the conversation is being grounded by shocking ignorance cultivated by a tragic press. And I just wondered if some recommendations about the ongoing conversation are part of the deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look, we don't make recommendations to government as a commission, but our very job is to address some of the issues that you raised. We are there to provide information to people so that we do get a better quality of understanding around some of these quite complex issues, scientific issues. And one heartening thing about the Commission's work is that I think we really have noticed a deepening of understanding as the years have gone by with our work. So at public forums like this, 2 years ago we were getting many questions about the basic science, and there was people weren't clear about a lot of issues that today many in the audience take for granted, and we often have a much more sophisticated discussion, in some ways a much more rewarding discussion. So I think the Australian community as a whole is really gaining better understanding of all of these issues. It's far from perfect, otherwise we'd be out of a job, but
and it pays so well.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman there, thanks.
Rod's my name. I just wanted to ask you about despite the overwhelming majority of science being clear about climate change, there appears to be very influential pockets of resistance. So I just wanted to ask, what was your view about the ways to best try to move that conversation forward, and what do you believe are successful ways we can try and do that moving forward?
Thank you.
Can I go there?
Yep.
Look, all we can do is try to provide information. I mean, there's only a certain number of people we can talk to directly like we can tonight, but we are providing, hopefully via our website and via our reports, a really huge amount of information. And what we're hoping to do is have a sort of ripple effect, so that, you know, everybody can go get good information. And, you know, there's one sure route to madness, and that's to type the words climate change into Google. You know, never do that, because you will go crazy. There's an awful lot of good information out there. There's an awful lot of misinformation out there. We're trying to be seen as a credible voice that people can go to. And when you find that information, talk about it with your family, your colleagues, your taxi driver, very importantly, your local politicians, your local councillors. I mean, really, we will only move forward in a serious way when the majority of the Australian population is doing that. It's certainly the majority of the population does think climate change is an important concern, but that doesn't mean they're motivated to do anything, and we need to step that up.
Thanks, Leslie. Yes, sir.
My name's Max. Too loud?
No, that's good.
Yeah. I'd like to draw the panel's attention to the CSIRO survey of opinion in Australia. They surveyed over 10,000 people, and they found that a majority of Australians do accept that climate change is happening, but a majority did not want to change their lifestyles to do anything to alter that. I was just wondering how concerning that is for us in terms of achieving our objectives.
Thank you.
Perhaps I'll start. Others may want to put something in, but just beginning, I mean, Australians are changing their lifestyles in some significant ways. We've seen 1 million Australian households put solar panels on their roofs, and that's a huge contribution to addressing climate change in this country. It's had some impacts on the electricity sector as a whole that have helped reduce emissions. There has been a drift towards greater fuel efficiency as well. 10% of Australians, last time I looked at least, took out some sort of green energy option, you know, some sort of with their energy provider. So I think that, you know, people don't want to dramatically change their lifestyles, and I would argue that we probably don't need to do that. We want to keep our amenity, but we need to do it more efficiently and with much less carbon-intensive fuels, and we are seeing that. I guess that, you know, there's some people who say, look, I just don't want to change anything. I'm going to keep driving my 8-cylinder car, and you know, just buy power from the grid, come what may. But as the years go by, that becomes more costly. So, and to be absolutely honest with you, the issue, this is a race against time as well. You know, we know that we have to get those emissions down substantially this decade to have a fair chance of avoiding 2 degrees of warming. It's a global challenge, and we need more motivation than we currently have, I argue.
And I think it's also important to recognise that you know, some of the technological solutions that Tim has referred to, there are a whole spectrum of opportunities that we can tap into. And a lot of these technologies are indeed going to get cheaper with time. So why wouldn't you look at scenarios into the future and see that as an investment that you make. So when you look at renewable technologies, for instance, it's really about investing into the future and looking at the benefits that you might incur in the long run, both from an environmental as well as economic perspectives.
We'll use the message stick. It does seem that the Madonna headsets have been provided by Exxon Valdez and Lord Monkton tonight. So we'll struggle on with them, but if we can pass the microphone when it's needed, that would be great. Thank you again so much for your questions. We're doing really well. We're about halfway through, so please, if you haven't had a chance yet, sorry, this young lady over here was first, and then I'll get to you, sir. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name's Olivia, and there have been claims that in order to just ensure a 2-degree increase in temperature, we would have to increase our decarbonisation by 6-fold. Do you think that the next generation is sufficiently prepared to do this, and what drastic measures would we have to take to
You want to blame it on young people. Now, if we can just explain decarbonisation in doing that, thanks.
Okay, look, I think that's basically the same math that I was showing up there, is that we still have a very long way to go. We're emitting much too much too fast. One of the reasons we call this the critical decade is it just isn't your generation that has to get things right. It's basically my generation, even though I'm even quite a bit older than Leslie, so I'm going to experience even a lower temperature in my average lifetime. So I won't see any of the worst of this. But a lot of people in my demographic actually are the investors. They run the superannuation funds. They're the people that have their hands on the big pockets of money. To me, the critical thing about this decade is, yes, we have to get emissions tipping down and moving strongly, but even more importantly, we have to put in place the investment decisions that's going to deliver the infrastructure for your generation to continue to have the good life that we've enjoyed, but at a much lower carbon cost. So this is really the critical decade for getting those investments right. And I think that we have to have a real focus on that over the next 5 to 10 years.
I think we owe it to you. Sorry, we owe it to you to give you a bit of hope as well. We all throw things in here, but there is real cause for optimism, particularly with clean energy technologies. I mean, the cost of production for solar panels has dropped about 80% in 4 years. So that's huge. I mean, that makes it very cost competitive, and those costs are likely to continue to drop. I've been in China recently, where I've seen the huge efforts that are going on there to shift to renewable energy. You know, this year China is going to be deploying about 49,000 megawatts worth of wind and solar power, and that's enough almost to supply all of Australia's electricity needs. That's going in a single year. And I know that the US and China are talking about a bilateral agreement on dealing with climate change. Together they represent about 40% of world emissions. And if that comes to pass, and we should hear next month some preliminary information on that, that will lead the world, we think, you know, faster than we are going at the moment towards a decarbonised future.
I think it's important for, particularly as, you know, we've been talking about new technologies and young people, whether they're looking at, you know, changing lifestyles, whether it's at a personal level or indeed, you know, where they end up working. It's important to look at opportunities and how they can have an impact and influence co-workers and colleagues. So I think it's also important to look at new technological solutions that not everyone may be aware of, but I think it's important to drive that change, to recognize that the changes is going to come. I mean, it's like, you know, you start to look at the use of mobile phones today. Who would have predicted that 10 years ago? So there are technological changes that can really take off very quickly. I think it's the motivation on our part to recognize the long-term benefits of taking on new technologies from an environmental context.
Okay, we'll just go to our next question. Yes, sir?
Right.
Yep.
Working?
Yep.
Right. My name's Frank. I'm just wondering, previous campaigns based on science, such as reducing the ozone layer, banning CFCs, banning asbestos, have been quite successful. Why in this case do people rubbish the science? Not everybody, but a huge amount. Has it got something to do with the power of the multinationals, or what?
Let's throw a conspiracy theory in there, shall we? Yes, Roger. Back the other way.
I think part of the problem here is that getting rid of CFCs required a fairly limited change in what individuals did. So it was easier for them to recognise it and respond to it, or not even be aware of it. And it was one of the first great global agreements to do with global pollution, 1976 in Montreal. So it's been a really tremendous achievement. Dealing with climate change is a little more difficult because we all contribute to it, every one of us around the world. It does require some changes in the way in which we do business. Changes are difficult. When you're being required to make a change because of science, your first step is to query the science. And I think that's a very human motivation. The key thing is to keep talking it through, right through the community, and encouraging action, because it's only through action that we will build the confidence in technologies and in the honest commitments of nations that will lead us eventually to global agreements. So we can't wait for a global agreement. What we have to do is build action to get a global agreement.
And
I'll just add something briefly there.
but you'll clearly wait until the microphone gets there.
Thank you, I will. Look, we forget history so often, and if you go back to Rachel Carson, who was the great campaigner against pesticides use in the 1960s in the United States, she had a hell of a time. Major industries came out against her. They accused her of being a communist, a lesbian, various other things. And the FBI opened a file on her. Her life was made an absolute misery, and people who followed in her footsteps to try to get some of these pesticides banned or limited have suffered the same sort of thing. So it's not just the climate scientists. If you talk to anyone involved in the antibiotics business and see what veterinary antibiotic use is like and how contested that space is, there's litigation going on all the time. Scientists lose their jobs in those areas. It's just that climate's a really big area and it involves everyone, that you see a lot more of it, I think.
Thanks, Tim. And right down the back, thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name's Roxanne, and first of all, I think it's a clever idea to tax the individual and businesses on carbon emissions, because how else are you going to reach every single person to be conscious about changing the way that they live? However, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that governments are the ones that decide, hey, you know, let's have solar-powered cars that are more affordable to the general person. Well, why is it that they're not affordable to the general person when, you know, the major part of this problem is our carbon emissions? So it may be a conspiracy theory, but I think perhaps the government may be riding on this situation a little bit and taxing us, you know, all these emissions while this problem is here, and then in the end, you know, making the final change that they need to, such as...
If we can just put that as a question, Roxanne.
So what I'm asking is, why is it that if this is such a problem at the moment with carbon emissions and this kind of thing, then instead of taxing the individual, why aren't they, you know, asking the big companies, hey, you know, put out the solar panel cars and that kind of thing?
Well, first of all, can I say that they aren't taxing the individual. Tax focuses under the current scheme on a limited number of very big emitters. That affects individuals because those costs are passed through the production chain into the market. Why are governments around the world taking this sort of action? To motivate those emitters to find alternative ways of producing products that they're engaged in. And right around the world, there is in fact a tremendous amount of investment going on by the global car companies on how to reduce emissions. we have found that there's no silver bullet in almost any of the areas that we've looked at. There's no one thing that can turn the situation around. It's really sort of silver buckshot. So there will be lots of things happening. We will learn slowly over time. And I think I'm hopeful that the great thing that will happen is that we will reduce our personal footprints, carbon footprints, without really noticing it. Just in a sense, we increase them without noticing it as we garnered the benefits of technology change over the last 50 years or so. So if we get the signals right, if we get government support for R&D to put the new technologies on the shelf, then I think we've got a great chance of actually achieving a 2-degree temperature change. But to do that, we've got to start very soon, more effectively.
Thanks, Roger. Yes, the lady there, thank you.
Nancy Sutherland.
And we're just...
Sorry.
You've got it now, Nancy. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah, Nancy Sutherland. I'm just wondering if it is the alpine and glacial ice that will disappear first, or is it the polar ice? And the second thing is...
Nancy, what did I say about 2 questions? You should have thought that through a bit better, shouldn't you?
All right. And will rivers like the Ganges only flow part of the year in the future?
Which one do you want answered?
No, we could do it together. First question.
Yeah. All right. I said the Chief Commissioner has graciously said we'll answer both, but I don't want this setting any kind of precedent. Thanks.
It's all part of the same question.
There's part A and part B. I stand corrected, Nancy.
Sorry, I didn't get the first part of that.
You go, Will.
No, you're going to answer it now, Tim. You're the one who took it on.
No, it's Will.
Okay. Right now, both glacial ice from continents like Alaska, the Himalaya, Andes and so on, that's being lost. So is polar ice. But there is so much more polar ice that it's going to be the mountains and Alaskan ice that goes first. The polar ice is going to take centuries, Antarctica millennia, to really lose all of it. But the point is there's so much ice there that even losing a small amount of it adds more to sea level than the glaciers in the Himalaya. Second question, yes, right now the glaciers in the Himalaya are providing a big free water tank, if you like, a water reservoir for the Ganges, for the Indian subcontinent, for some of the other big rivers, because they trickle that out during the dry season. Once they get to too low a point, the flow is going to be much more erratic in those rivers. And Leslie might want to talk about the consequences of that.
Yeah, look, I'll just bring it back to Australia. I don't think... Do I need that?
Yes, you do need that.
The worst case scenario modelling for the Australian snow is that we probably won't have any snow left in the Snowy Mountains by the end of this century. So that's sort of reasonable worst case. We've actually been losing over the last 4 decades about 10% of our snow per decade. So we're getting 40% less snow now than we got in the 1960s. So that has all sorts of impacts, not just for the ski industry, of course, but also for alpine biodiversity. Our alpine zone, as we know it today, probably won't exist in the second half of this century. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Leslie. Sorry, there's that woman there. I'm so sorry. And sorry, if everyone who's got a microphone now can just pop your hands up so I can see who's there. You and you. Yes, good. Okay, thank you. Yes, sorry.
My name's Rosie Cooper, and Professor Flannery, I actually was inspired to read your book, The Weathermakers, after I heard that Richard Branson had been inspired to start the Carbon War Room. Have you heard of it? And do you think he's actually onto something with trying to find a way to bring carbon back out of the atmosphere?
Well, he's using 2 initiatives to try to bring carbon out of the atmosphere. The Carbon War Room is one, but there's the Virgin Earth Challenge as well. And I sit as one of the judges along with Al Gore and Sir David King and a couple of other people on that prize. We are making progress towards that. It's going to be the world's largest prize, £25 million, for a technology that can demonstrate, I think it's or not demonstrate, but has the potential to draw 1 gigaton, I think it is, of carbon per year out of the atmosphere. Now, no one, we've looked across sectors, and there is some promising technologies out there, but none have yet shown that they can do that. Within the next year or so, I think it's possible there will be a winner. We can't be sure, but there may be. So technology is one of those things that's changing incredibly quickly. Vina can tell you stories about amazing things that are happening in the technological realm, from steel making through to whatever. I think that it's quite possible that technology will be developed that can do that, but as yet, we're yet to see firm evidence.
Well, you can't just leave a tease like that. What is the technology that's likely to... do you mean you've heard of something that's getting close? Or?
Sure, look, there are a number of categories of technology, right? So there's ocean sequestration. That has many potential problems, not all fatal, but it certainly can have a big impact on oceanic ecosystems. There is sequestration on land by using char-based technologies. This is where you make charcoal and put it into soil. There are also technologies which, where you create artificial trees, basically an artificial kind of a photosynthesis or a resin that captures CO2 out of the atmosphere, which you can then scrub out afterwards. But you need to put that CO2 somewhere or put it to use. So there's a number of different approaches which are being worked through at the moment, all of which have some promise, but all of which, quite frankly, are at very early stages and need to be further developed before they can really show they have the potential to take a gigaton of carbon, which is
a billion tonnes.
A billion tonnes of carbon per year out of the atmosphere. And we're putting in, is it 40 billion tonnes of CO2?
No, well, you're talking about carbon or CO2?
That's CO2, I think, the way...
Okay, we're putting between 35 and 40 billion tonnes of CO2, about 10 billion tonnes of carbon.
Yeah,
just if you look at carbon.
That's right. So I think the prize, even if we have that technology, it's still only taking out 1/40th of what we put in, even though we're talking about billion tonnes, it's a lot.
Well, thanks, Tim, although what I really wanted to know was who to bet on for that, but so that was no help whatsoever. Yeah, thank you. And yes, here, thanks.
Hi, I'm Maddie Braddon. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to listen to experts in your field. It's really wonderful. My question is, how important is climate change adaptation at this current time, and are there areas where climate change has impacted to a point of no return?
Well, that's a really big question. Look, climate change adaptation is hugely important. We are already adapting in all sorts of ways, and adaptation can take the form of, as we were talking before, where councils will allow developments to occur, for example. There's huge adaptation going on in our agricultural sector, whether it be breeding new varieties of wheat and rice to grow at higher temperatures, or in some cases more drastic things are happening, such as in the wine industry. We've had quite a few vineyards now move from Victoria to Tasmania that grow cool climate wines that are just have taken that financial decision to just go somewhere else. And I think we'll increasingly see a lot of shifts in our agricultural sector, because there's lots of things we won't be able to grow where we grow them now. So adaptation is hugely important, even if we're really good at limiting greenhouse gas emissions, because we are very likely to still get at least a degree on top of what we've got now, or compared to 1990, because of all the CO2 we've already put into the atmosphere. So the saying that Will often quotes is, we have to, what is it?
We have to avoid the unadaptable, but we have to adapt to the unavoidable.
Oh, yes.
I'll quiz you on that later, so remember it over a cuppa.
I think you should put it on the back page of the report and everyone should be quizzed on it. Yes, thank you.
Good evening, my name's Nicole Garofano. I'm really quite grateful to be having the opportunity, like this young lady, to come tonight. I'm a firm believer in education being part of a choice for humans to make lifestyle changes. And I wanted to know, in your 21 presentations and other work, what is the reaction of educators and the government bodies of education to promoting, you know, climate change awareness from a very young age, and if, you know, how successful that's been?
Thank you.
Well, I'll just tell you a story about my two now older teenage children. When a couple of years ago, my daughter came home from school one day and she said, "Oh, Mum, we did climate change again today." So I think our young people are very well educated about climate change compared to our age, because they are getting it at school. I'm sure they're getting it better in some curricula than in others. But I think young people, you know, it's part of the science curriculum and it's just what they learn. And a lot of them are pretty worried for very good reason. So, yes, look, I think education's hugely important, and I think it's very important for everybody to know what their own personal carbon footprint comes from, for example. And you can actually go on the web and type in carbon footprint calculator and work out your personal carbon footprint, and you'll be really quite surprised where it comes from, and I think it's up to all of us to educate ourselves like that.
I might just say as well that here in Queensland you've got some fabulous examples of educational institutions that we've visited as a commission that are doing great things. The University of Queensland has a really innovative solar array right up there in the front of the institution, which is, it's a world first, it's a leading thing. And you've got, I think is it John Paul College here in not too far
in Logan, I think it is.
Yeah, which, you know, the Stats School has got the most outstanding water and energy conservation project I've seen of any school. It really is a world leader, and they're getting inquiries about that from schools all around the place who want to learn from them. And of course, and the kids play an integral role in all of that. When we went out there and met the teachers, they were telling us how vigilant the kids were about water use and energy use and how much they knew. So I think that Australia's educational sector, you know, from what we've seen as a commission, is doing a great job in terms of creating awareness about this and the need for energy efficiency and so forth. But right here in Queensland, you're doing a particularly fine job.
Thanks, and I'm sorry that you've been in a high-vis vest and you haven't been given a microphone for so long, but please, your question.
No, thank you. I can understand where you come from as far as sceptics go. I mean, we've all seen experts tell us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we've heard about computer experts telling about Y2K virus, and our political leaders seem to lack any type of integrity at the moment, and they don't seem to have any commitment towards climate change. A good example is our car industry. Now, one of the reasons why it's failing is because we're making the same type of car as every other automaker in the world. Why doesn't our government commit to making a low carbon emitting car? That $9 billion they spent could have been put towards research and development in making a lower carbon emitting car. Why aren't we doing that?
Veena, I think that's the Solutions Commissioner's question.
You know, I mean, you can use that as an example, but I think you can go across a whole spectrum of different opportunities where industries, industries
Into the mic, Veena. It's like you're on television. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernie. I'd forgotten. You can look at a whole range of different industrial processes. There is no question that there are energy-guzzling, carbon-intensive industries, and that's just because they've been business as usual. That's how processes have been running for a long time. But the good news is a lot of different industry sectors have been looking at opportunities to innovate. So it's not just about, well, let's just wait for, you know, certain programs to come up. It's really about being very smart and questioning how I can become more energy efficient, because it's not just going to give you benefits from an environmental context. It's actually going to help you reduce your power bills. So I think there are good reasons why industrial sectors are looking at a whole range of different opportunities. And you don't have to feel like every new solution has to be discovered in-house. I mean, you can look across the world and look at a whole range of different solutions that exist in different sectors. I can give you an example from, I mean, the one that's kind of relevant here. We're talking about steel industry. Tim's referred to some of the work that we've done. That looks at how we might be able to reduce the use of coal in the process of making steel. And the way we've actually achieved that is by introducing recycled rubber tires into the process. And what that does is not only reduces our dependency on coal, but also equally importantly helps us recycle waste. But the most important outcome that we've seen is the overall amount of energy that we actually need to produce steel has come down significantly. So I think it's again an indication that there are a lot of innovative solutions out there. It's a question of, can we actually start to take up these solutions to ultimately, in the long run, for sustainability of our businesses.
It always comes back to steel with you, Veena, doesn't it? We've only got time for one or two more questions, I'm sorry, but don't forget the commissioners will be here for a cup of tea with you afterwards, so if you haven't had a chance or are a bit shy about asking a question, feel free to ask them afterwards. We have one here, yes?
Hi, my name's Rochelle James. This is in the field of threatened species conservation. Taking into consideration all the threatening processes that we have at the moment, do you have any suggestions for conservationists when it comes to climate change on what we can do to ensure the persistence of those species that can still persist into the future?
Look, to answer that, I could talk for about 3 hours about that, and I won't. The main thing we can do is to do better what we should have been doing for the last 200 years, which, as I said before, was to reduce all the other threats that make our species more vulnerable. But there are also some more sort of new and innovative things we need to think about. And in some ways it's about not being so conservative about conservation. Conservationists are very conservative people, not in the political sense, but in the sense of wanting to conserve everything where they think they've always been. We are going to have to move a lot of things around to save things. So we do have to think about a more dynamic world. But we won't be able to move everything, and most of the calculations about species extinction rates are pretty depressing. One of the studies I was involved in indicated that by 2050, between 30 and 50% of the global species will be at increased risk of extinction. They won't be extinct by then, but they'll be on a trajectory of increased risk. So it is an extremely serious problem. We have to be less conservative about where we conserve, but mostly we just need to do all the things we should have been doing much better, and that includes treasuring our national parks even more than we treasure them now.
So it's kind of like collateral advantage rather than collateral damage by addressing the other issues. Yes, in the striped top, thanks. And depending on how quick that goes, we might have time for our last question over here.
I'll be really quick. Good evening, my name's Kim. My question is for Leslie and Will, based on your earlier presentation, which I found very informative, is what happened in 1960 or in the 1960s? All the graphs seem to be going up then.
It was the sexual revolution. It was a time of great change in music. And
well, listen, that was my use, so that's cutting it a bit close to the bone there, Bernie. So we'll be a bit careful with the answer here.
I was going to say a lot of heavy breathing.
I'll give you the really quick answer. After World War II, a lot of old European feudal institutions were broken down. Increased science and technology from the war effort was put into the civilian economy. Global connectivity started leaping ahead with technology, globalization. All that added up to what we call the Great Acceleration. You see it in CO2 emissions, you see it in nitrogen on the landscape, you see it in mobile phones, you see it in motor cars, you see it in everything. And if you give me your email address, I'll send you a few papers on that afterwards. It's a topic that I research on these days, so it's dear to my heart.
I think he's hitting on you, which is... No, I'm sure he's not. A commissioner would never do that.
That's right.
Would they?
No.
And we do have time for our last question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jane. Just Clive Hamilton actually argues that geoengineering is well underway. If it is, as an industry, will that make us lazy and actually stop doing anything about climate change?
Yeah, very quick comment on geoengineering, and Tim referred to one possible way of doing that, which is to use oceans to soak up more carbon. The most commonly mentioned or proposed type is to basically put pollution way up in the stratosphere, the upper atmosphere, sulfate particles, because that intercepts some of the incoming sunlight and cools the Earth's surface. Big volcanoes do it naturally. But there are quite drastic side effects of that. It changes rainfall patterns, for example, and may even change the amount of rainfall. Ocean acidification would continue with really dire consequences for a lot of marine ecosystems. So it could very well be that the cure is worse than, or at least as bad as the disease. There is no geoengineering technique proposed now that does not have serious side effects. My view is, at least in the scientific community, there is absolutely no taking the foot off the pedal in terms of getting emissions down. If anything, these geoengineering things frighten us even more and make us even more determined to get these emissions under control.
Thanks, Will. And Roger.
Can I just add a little? I wouldn't give up research on geoengineering because we might have to do some of these things, and Tim has just talked about some of the activities that he's been involved in. But agreeing with Will, one of the problems with geoengineering, for example, sulfates and aerosols in the high atmosphere, is that as soon as you stop putting them in, the warming rockets back up again. It's a little bit like having a patient who's got a badly fractured leg with the beginnings of gangrene and just feeding the patient with morphine to keep the pain down. It might make them feel better for a while, but the actual underlying problem is getting worse and worse and worse.
I think the gangrene visual brought it home even more than your graph earlier, Leslie. Thank you very much for that. And I'm afraid that that's the end of our time for the formal Q&A. Would you please join me in thanking the Commissioners? And more importantly, thank you to everyone who asked a question for keeping them so concise, and also I'm sorry to people who didn't get a chance to ask a question, but as I've said, we're now going to join you for a cup of tea outside. But please, before you go, use that free gift wisely and fill out your feedback form, because it will make sure that if there are things we can do to make these conversations better for the people coming and taking part of them, that can be considered for the upcoming conversations. Thanks very much, and we'll see you outside for a cup of tea soon. Oh, I'm sorry. Tim?
We'll just go for a cup of tea.
Okay, we'll just go for a cup of tea. Okay. Thanks very much. Cheers.